Thanks. It's great to be here today. I was enjoying the last presentation, and listening to the VA job interview made me think back to my NASA job interview when I went to apply to be an astronaut. But they did not ask me, why would anybody want this job? That was something I was kind of chuckling at the job interview process. But I want to talk a little bit about life in space and my time in space, and then apply that to the domain of space and how that is becoming such an important, more so and more so as time goes on. But every good space talk begins with launch. And this is a picture that I had kind of snuck a camera out to the launch pad, and I got this candid snapshot of my crewmates looking up at the rocket. And I think ever since Yuri Gagarin first flew in space, every astronaut who's gone out, you just have to stand there and stare at this giant beast. It was a really cold, early February morning in Florida. There was steam coming off the tank, and it looked like, to me, this hypersonic dragon that was coming to life. And when you get suited up in your orange suits, it's in crew quarters. The technicians put the suits on. You walk out, and there's a big crowd that's bigger than this right here cheering for you. And you drive through a checkpoint. There's a smaller crowd, and then you get to the launch pad, and there are these guys standing there with guns. And you go up, and that big white box that you can see next to Endeavour is the closeout crew, and the last guy that you see straps you in, says good luck, and you hear the hatch shut. So the crowd was getting smaller and smaller as we got to the shuttle, which kind of made me wonder, question my intelligence. So after you land from a space flight, you go around all the different NASA centers and you talk to contractors and thank them and thank the secretaries and thank the engineers. And when we went back to the Kennedy Space Center where we launched from, we met with the security guys, and I said, hey, you guys were out there with your guns, is there ISIS terrorists waiting in the swamps to get us? And the guy looked at me and said, no, we're there to make sure you get on the rocket. So I think he was, and I don't think he was joking. But anyway, the experience of launch itself is pretty amazing. I don't know if you guys, we'll see if the audio works.
10.
There you go.
9, 8, 7.
If you ever had a chance to
6,
see a shuttle launch,
5. We have to go from
it's an amazing thing.
2, 1, 0. Booster ignition and liftoff of Shuttle Endeavour with NASA's final space station crew compartment that brings a bay window view to our celestial backyard.
There was a thin cloud deck pretty low, so as soon as those rocket engines lit, eastern Florida, it turned from night to day. There was about 100,000 people watching. And the experience is just amazing. The shuttle had those two big white solid rocket motors, and they each burned about 10,000 pounds a second of fuel. The three main engines burn about 1,000 pounds a second of fuel. So that's 23,000 pounds every second. And so the gas mileage sucked, but the top end speed was pretty good. That would be a good problem for this quantum computing, to try and improve the gas mileage on the rocket. But it was an amazing experience. I love this picture, in part because I'm in it, but a guy, James Vernicatella, was the photographer. It's just a beautiful shot, and there's so many things that happen, even during that 8.5-minute ride into space. The whole first chapter of my book was about launch, but it was a pretty awesome experience. This was my destination for both of my flights, my 2-week shuttle flight, and then my 200-day Soyuz flight where Eric had come to watch me launch. The shuttle mission was STS-130, and it was actually the final assembly sequence. As you guys know, we started the station back in 1998, and we built it piece by piece, more than a decade to build this thing. So I had the honor of being the last guy up there building it. And then a few years later, I went back and spent 200 days. And then the typical station mission is not just on the shuttle, we had to bring these two modules and attach them. But for day-to-day station ops, you do everything. You're the barber, I was the hair cutter, you're the scientist, you're the pilot, you're the spacewalker, you're doing media interviews, you just have to do everything. It's an amazing vehicle, it's huge. I'm sure many of you have seen it. You can see it in the early morning or early evening hours, and it's bigger than a football field. It's really an amazing piece of equipment. And it's actually a national laboratory. It's the ISS National Laboratory. It's how the US government portion of the space station is run. It's an amazing place. And life in space is pretty cool for many reasons, but I'm often asked, what does it feel, what is it like in space? That's one of the most common questions. And the answer is, it feels like you're falling. And the reason it feels like you're falling is because you're falling. If you're on Earth and I drop the clicker, it'll fall straight to the ground. In space, our orbit's only a few hundred miles up, so gravity's about 90% of what it is here. It's not 0 G, there's lots of gravity. So if you were just standing still there and you drop the clicker, it would fall towards the center of the Earth almost as quickly as it does here. The difference is you're moving forward at 17,000 plus miles an hour. So as your clicker falls, it moves forward really fast, and it falls and it moves forward. And if you're at the exact right speed, that just makes a curve that matches the shape of the Earth, and that's what an orbit is. So what it feels like, your body is falling and the spaceship's falling, and in this picture, that ball of water is falling. You know, everything is falling. So it takes some time to get used to moving around in space. And in space, you move with your hands and carry things with your feet, which is a little bit different. But I was really fascinated by the process, by that learning curve. It's not artificial intelligence learning, it's actually real intelligence that learns how to move around in a completely alien environment really quickly. You don't have a couple years from being born to learning how to walk and run. You know, as soon as the engines get turned off, you're floating, and your brain has to adapt really, really quickly. And it was really fascinating for me to see that intelligence learning curve and how steep it was. A big aspect of being in space is exercising. And on Earth, we're all exercising. Your guys' neck muscles are trying really hard not to fall asleep right now, right? We've all been sitting here for hours. Just sitting there, your bones are fighting gravity and your muscles are keeping yourself up. And you never have even that very minimal amount of work you're doing now when you're in space. And so astronauts, one of the problems is your muscles get weak, but a big problem is your bones also get weak. It's the equivalent of osteoporosis. That is a common disease on Earth. A lot of older women tend to get it. And we've learned over the years of spending a lot of time in space that by exercise, weightlifting, just basic resistive exercise, also we had a treadmill. Here's a video of me running on the treadmill, and riding a bike, that you could combat that. The treadmill is pretty interesting. First of all, it's on the wall, which is not normal. And second of all, it's floating. You see how that thing is moving around. And this is our weightlifting machine. My crewmate Samantha's doing some deadlifts. That also is not bolted to the wall. It's floating. There's a vibration isolation system, so you don't put all that vibration into the station. So anyway, going through those 3 different exercises, they scheduled us 2.5 hours a day. I was able to, after a 200-day mission, come back and have lost 0% of my bone density. So it's a really important thing, especially for women, because osteoporosis is such a problem. A little bit of resistive exercise can really stop that. And that's one of the many things we've learned on the station. Another aspect of life in space is going outside. And I love this picture. This is actually a GoPro. The Russians had a GoPro. I think they went to Best Buy and bought a GoPro, and they built this a little small box to keep it not too hot, not too cold, keep it air pressurized so that it would operate. And I took it out there with me, clicked it on. The IMAX movie that Eric was talking about actually used this GoPro footage on the giant IMAX screen, and it looks pretty amazing. But in this picture, or a short video clip, it's a selfie I just held out there, but you can see there is a pile of stuff in front of me. All this equipment, tools, the gear that I'm working with. 99% of your time outside on a spacewalk is spent with a face full of metal and gear, and everything has to be tethered so it doesn't float away. And that suit on Earth is about 400 pounds. It's really, really bulky and stiff and hard to move in. So doing spacewalks is a definite workout, because when you get into the suit to when you get out of the suit is probably 9 hours. That's a lot of time in this bulky thing. It's super busy. There's so many tasks. You just have to stay focused over this period of many hours, and it kind of wears you out. But it's also awesome. And there were a few moments I had free. I felt like I was seeing creation, like I was hearing from God, seeing things that people shouldn't hear or see. And then it was back to work because I have to plug in a cable. It was a really, really strong juxtaposition between sublime and mundane. President Kennedy's speech. We're going to commit ourselves to going to the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. That was my favorite part of his speech, was the returning him safely to the Earth. And as a test pilot, getting into orbit is amazing. You have to add 17,000 miles an hour of kinetic energy into your body and your spaceship, which is amazing. But you also have to take out that same amount of kinetic energy. And I found the return was even more, impressive or dangerous or whatever. This is a view out of one of the Soyuz windows, also taken with a GoPro. But it really shows what happens when your vehicle hits the air going so fast and you turn normal air into plasma. This is several thousand degrees, I don't know exactly what, but it goes through this pink to orange to gray transition of this fireball show outside. The Soyuz actually splits into 3 pieces, and there's a bunch of thermal blankets that are designed to rip away. So the thing's banging, pieces are flying by your window the whole time, and I was thinking, I hope that's the right piece that just burned off. But it was. The Russian equipment, the Russians have a very simple and robust design philosophy. It's a big, thick piece of metal. Actually, one time, the modules didn't separate, and it came back into the atmosphere backwards with the heat shield behind the crew. And eventually, the other module melted off, and it flipped around in the right direction. And that, you may think, wow, that's scary. But I think that was a good demonstration of that the design of having a lot of margin really came through in that. But this is a video of the actual landing. The space shuttle was a nice, smooth kind of Air Force landing on a runway, like an airplane. The Soyuz is more like a Navy landing. So you'll see this. This is the 3 of us crammed in the capsule. It's under a parachute, and they land on land in Kazakhstan. If you have a map, look up nowhere, and in the middle of that is where we are. But it's quite an experience. It was definitely not the space shuttle experience. Someone said, "Are we alive?" We're alive. So that's what it's like coming back to Earth on the Soyuz. But it's very simple. They've been doing this for 40 years, and it works. So these are just a few photos. Photography is kind of my thing. I ended up taking well over 300,000 stills, and there's some poor guy at JSC that has to count all this stuff. We probably should get him some cloud technology to count it automatically, but he was very happy when I landed. A lot of these images went into the IMAX movie, and some of them went into my book, but it was just kind of my passion about being in space. This was Typhoon Maisak. It was the biggest ever Pacific storm recorded. It was amazing. I saw 23 different hurricanes and tropical systems, and each one of them is both beautiful and really daunting because these things are deadly. But this thing was just huge, and that eye was really impressive. I love this picture. This is just Earth, and it happens to be over the Pacific, but it could be just about anywhere. I actually use color. I use names of colors for a few different chapters in my book. And if you look at Earth, if you were just randomly deposited in orbit around Earth, you would see water. You would either see blue water, which is most of the planet, or you would see clouds. Even over the Sahara or the Australian outback, there's clouds. You'll see a few little white things down there, here and there. Or if you're over Canada or Russia, you'll see white, which is snow and ice. And so it's just really powerful how important water is in our life, which is really oxygen. And if you look on the edge of this picture, there's that thin blue line, and that's our atmosphere. And so everybody you've ever known was born and raised and died below that line, and beyond that, there is nobody unless there's some astronauts going out there. So it's really kind of powerful to see the planet from that perspective, and this is it. This is our planet. There's no, in Interstellar they had a plan B, but there's actually no plan B. This is it. One of my favorite things to do, if I was flying over South America or Africa or the South Pacific at nighttime, I would go down to the cupola. Is this 7-windowed module. I installed it on the shuttle flight. It's everybody's favorite place because you can look out over the Earth. It's like that scene when Darth Vader's standing there in front of the window and Luke comes up to have the battle with him. It's that same exact design, only ours is a lot smaller on the space station, and there's no lightsabers in there. But I would go down there and just float. I would let go of the handrails and just kind of float and look up at the planet and watch the thunderstorms go by below. And this is a time lapse, so it's sped up a little bit, but it was really like that. I mean, the amount of energy in those storms is just incredible. This is another incredible thing. This is the Northern Lights, and PowerPoint's not having fun with this. Anyway, blink your eyes, try and get it in sync with this thing. It's not working up there either. Yeah, it's weird. Anyway, they're amazing. I've never seen them from the planet. The Northern Lights are always off in the distance because the North Magnetic Pole is near the North Pole. The Southern Lights are actually these huge green cloud. One night we actually flew through them, and the reason is the South Magnetic Pole is a lot farther from the South Pole, and so our orbit actually goes really close to the Southern Lights. But the aurora are just spectacular from space. This one's working, right? Yes. Nope, it's me. There we go. This is just the moon set. I saw hundreds of these things, and they were all unique and never got old. One of the problems with being an astronaut is that your bucket list gets too long, which actually leads into this project I'm working on right now to do a new TV show. But this is the Bahamas, and you can see sand dunes down there. You see sand dunes in Namibia. I've got a slide coming up that just shocked me. I didn't realize you could see sand dunes from space, but they're so big. But these are just sand dunes, only the fluid is water and not air, so they're just beautiful. This is actually Patagonia, which is this amazing, I mean, from space, it looks amazing, and I had a chance to go down there a few months ago and film a pilot for this TV show that we're hoping to do, but it's amazing. These mountain lakes, each one of them is a different color blue, depending on the minerals in the mountain. The snow, it's really a beautiful thing. You can see these glaciers there. It's pretty awesome. This picture, a lot of times if I'm doing a talk for National Geographic, I'll do a quiz. Hey, where am I? And everybody can guess Italy. When I get to this slide, people not only can't guess where it is, but they don't know what it is. And this is actually Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, the Big Island. And I was flying over there, it was a daytime, and it was orbital noon, so the sun was directly overhead. And as I flew over this big island, all of a sudden, because of the sun glint, all these rivers showed up, and you couldn't see them, and all of a sudden, boom, there's 100 rivers. So I took this picture, and I remember thinking, what are the people down there thinking? What would they think if they knew that there was an astronaut in space taking pictures of them? It was a really kind of profound moment to think how far our technology's come. This conference right here kind of is an example of that. It's not up there. Can you guys not? Oh, there it is over there. Okay. So to give you an idea what this is, the black is the jungle. And it's so high contrast, the dark and bright, it just made it black and white. And the white at the bottom is the ocean, and all those little shiny white things are rivers flowing out of the jungle. Okay, we're back. So this is an example of those sand dunes. This is not Namibia, this is actually Algeria, but the desert, especially the Sahara, is really, really intensely orange and red in this part, and the mountains are really almost black, and the colors are really spectacular. Anybody recognize this? It's Las Vegas, yes. So you can see the strip, shows up pretty well down there. The Grand Canyon is kind of right next door, and it's not that big. Like the first time I wasn't sure. I'm like, okay, there's the Rockies and the Pacific. Is that the Grand Canyon? It just doesn't show up nearly as big as it does when you go down to it. All my pictures were not of Earth, so I took some time to actually look out into the universe. And when you do that, and you close your eyes, let your eyes get adjusted, and look away, it's just spectacular. And this is just our galaxy going by. That brown band is the atmosphere, and during the day, the blue band is really thin, and that brown band is, I estimated it's like 5 times thicker. And it just shows that the atmosphere goes up pretty high, but it's, you can't breathe it. You would die instantly if you were up there, but there is a little bit of atmosphere, but it's still pretty thin. And that glint on the ocean there is the moon. That's not the sun. That's the moonlight shining on the ocean with our Milky Way galaxy in the background. This shot is courtesy of IMAX. Thank them for letting me use it. They had some fancy software that took my images and kind of flew through them. The best part about being in space was flying with my crew. I do a whole talk about this. I don't have time to get into it now because we're all hungry, but flying with Russians and Italians and Americans during 2012 and 13 and 14 and 15, for training and my flight, it hasn't been the best of times between the West and Russia, and yet here I was in Russia training with Russians flying, and I love flying with those guys. We would, in Russia you're always doing a toast if you're in training, or, and I always tried to have dinner with the Russian crew, and we would always go, look, politics is politics, but let's try and stay alive because we're in outer space together. We were not, the political problems of Earth were definitely not, we didn't care at all about them. And I'm still friends with these guys. We still text each other and email and see each other when we can. There's a whole chapter I wrote in my book about this one story. I'll go through it really briefly, but on the station, there's 3 different types of emergencies that we train for: fire, an air leak, and you get those alarms sometimes, a lot of false alarms, especially for fire. But the third one is ammonia, an ammonia leak, and that's the most serious and most deadly. In fact, on the ground, our trainers told us, if you smell ammonia, you don't have to worry about working the procedure for it because you're going to die. So it's a really deadly chemical. I don't know if anybody works in any chemical industry, but ammonia is really bad. It's our coolant fluid we use. The Russians use glycol, which is sugar water, and it's not as good, it's not as efficient of a coolant as ammonia is. But the advantage is it doesn't kill you dead. So there's again, design philosophy difference. So we actually had an ammonia alarm go off. We all had to go down to the Russian segment and close the hatch. And in the middle of all this stuff, there's a guy named Dmitry Rogozin. You may have heard about him. He was the deputy under Putin. He was like Mike Pence during this time. He's now in charge of the Russian space program. He actually called us on the radio and said, hey, Americans, we're going to work through this. You can stay as long as you need to. We'll work together. Not Americans. He was talking to the crew. And that was a great example of how people can and should work together. It was kind of like the most important thing about the space station, I think, that's come out of the program. It was a really good story. Have to talk more later. But I want to shift from my time in space to some bigger strategic vision things happening on Earth. And did everybody see this? I'm sure many of you saw this. The SpaceX landing last year. They launched this Falcon Heavy booster, and then 2 of the first stage rockets flew back and landed in formation. And I was watching that from home, from my apartment, and I remember thinking, this is like a 1950s science fiction movie. I mean, this is just amazing. And I was actually excited about space for the first time in a long time. And it was really emblematic, I think, of some big changes. And I read this in an op-ed recently. I think it's a Winston. Every quote you've ever read, somebody ascribes to Winston Churchill. But the term was the end of the beginning. And that really hit me. And I think that really applies to the space age. I think we're at the end of the beginning. The beginning of the space age was Yuri Gagarin and Apollo and Sputnik and Space Shuttle and Space Station. It was these big government programs that did amazing things. But at the end of the day, they're government programs. And we have, the internet age has enabled us to have people become billionaires. I was talking to Jeff Bezos at this thing last year, and the way he puts it is he won the Amazon lottery. And he wants to use some of those proceeds to explore space. And you can really see what's happened with SpaceX and Bezos and Bigelow, who's based here in Las Vegas, and others. They're doing things so much faster and so much more innovative than really most government agencies can do. And I'll use this example to put things in perspective. Between the time when President Eisenhower created NASA, in 1958, he signed the document, here's NASA. between that document being signed and when we were finished with Apollo, when Gene Cernan left the moon on Apollo 17, that time frame is much shorter than when NASA's current rocket, the SLS, was born back in 2005 when George Bush started the Constellation program. So when SLS was born and when it will fly for the first time, and when it flies for the first time, it's only going to fly, the first stage will be SLS, the second stage will be a Delta IV upper stage, and it won't be manned, it'll be unmanned. So between when SLS was born and when it flies sort of partially for the first time is much longer than NASA being created and we're done with Apollo. So that just kind of gives you an idea of how things have devolved as far as being able to do things. But I think the good news is we have companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin, and I'll put that same time frame in perspective from when SpaceX was created, when Elon Musk started it, to in that same amount of time frame, they have taken over the global launch industry. If you look at it, Eric's company did a taxonomy of the space industry. And for years and years, Russians mostly did almost all commercial launches. They kind of ran the space industry. Atlas and Delta and ULA here in America had some part of it. The Chinese or the Japanese and the Europeans have subsidized space programs, so they did some launches. And now SpaceX does them all. I mean, they don't do them all, but they've really, just in the matter of a few years, completely taken over that launch industry in a shorter time than SLS being started and not even having flown yet. So I'm just putting those kind of time scales in perspective to show what private sector innovation can do versus what traditional government bureaucracy can do. And that's good news, because if we can figure out how to do public-private partnerships well, we can let the government do things that only they can do, negotiate treaties with countries. You know, nuclear power in space is important. There's some things that only the government can do. And if we let the private sector do what they're good at doing, building rockets and coming up with innovative ways to do things, I think our space program can get even better than it was before. And that's kind of why I say it's the end of the beginning. And I want to talk about space as a domain in terms of things that are happening there. And obviously small sats, CubeSats, nanosats, these little small, you know, much smaller than traditional satellites, can do lots of things. I'm out of time now, I can't go into it. I was just at a Google conference in Silicon Valley last month. There's obviously lots of applications. They can bring distributed architecture, they can capture imagery, communications, there's all kinds of things. We don't even know what they can do. Let the 25-year-olds, give them some money and some time and they'll think of amazing things that we haven't thought of yet. So that is a big part of what's happening in space. SpaceX and soon to be Blue Origin and others are making launch costs for medium and even large rockets more affordable. And as it becomes easier and more affordable to put stuff in space, the problem of debris in space, I'll bring this up as one of the problems, is a massive one, because the movie Gravity, if you saw that, that was basically, the premise was some satellites hit each other and turned into a debris cloud. That's a real thing. While I was on the space station, I actually had to maneuver to avoid some debris that our Chinese friends had created back in 2007 when they did this military anti-satellite weapons test. They blew up a satellite in our same orbit, and about once a year, several times a year, we have to maneuver the station to avoid this debris. So satellites accidentally running into each other. Iridium lost a satellite a couple years ago. A dead Russian satellite hit it, and it created this debris cloud we have to maneuver from. The Chinese did that, and we still have to maneuver. But if somebody were actively shooting and blowing up satellites, you could end an orbit forever. I mean, it would take hundreds of years or more for all that debris to go away. So the, assured access to space is definitely not assured, because making these clouds of debris, either by accident or militarily, can definitely threaten what we do there, which is just one of the many issues that comes up in the space universe. So space as a domain is very important. I will say this, as a 30-year plus Air Force guy, there's no air in space. Space, by definition, there's no air there, and space is not airplanes. It's a different domain entirely. the kind of people that operate in space, the equipment that operates in space, your techniques of operating in space are completely unrelated to flying airplanes. They're also not cyber. Cyber is not air or land or sea. And so there's been a big debate about Space Force and multi-domain warfare, which there's no debate about that. That's what we do. But I think personally, my view is that a better way to organize, train, and equip is by domain. You could put the infantry in the Navy, and I'm sure it would run fine, but the smarter thing to do is have an army for the infantry. A smarter thing to do is have an Air Force for airplanes. Even though we won World War II with the Army Air Corps, it's just smarter to have an Air Force. And I think it's smarter to have an organization that handles space and an organization that handles cyber, just because they're so unrelated. So that is like a lot of topics in a quick amount of time. I was going to do Q&A, but I think we're out of time. And is anybody running the show here? Do we have time for that, or should we be done? Yeah, okay. So thank you guys very much. Yeah, thanks.
How great was that? Let's do it one more time. That was awesome.
Thank you, Don.
Thank you. You're going to be with us at lunch, too.
Yeah.
Oh, good. Terry's going to be with us at lunch, so that was really good. And it also, what your comments on the commercial and government and who can do what best also will feed into the panel that we have perfectly, where we have three nations, United States perspective, the European Space Agency, and the